It all began with a letter that didn't make any sense. I had been living in my home for several years, proud of the fact that I not only owned my house but also had a private garage deeded directly to me. That garage wasn't part of the shared community property, it wasn't under any kind of lease, and it was written in black and white on my property deed that it belonged solely to me. For years, everything had been normal. I parked my car there every evening, stored some seasonal items, and even made minor upgrades like better lighting and shelving. It was my space, no different from my living room or kitchen. But then, one morning, I opened the mailbox and found an official-looking envelope with the HOA's letterhead. Inside was a notice demanding $150 a month in garage rent, starting immediately. They claimed that garages in the community were considered shared amenities, and anyone who wanted to use one had to pay a monthly fee. The notice even included a threat: failure to pay would result in fines, penalties, and potentially a lien placed on my home. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely, they had mixed up my address with someone else's. But when I called the number listed, the HOA representative coldly confirmed that the notice was intentional. According to them, all garages in the community fell under HOA management, and ownership didn't matter. I was stunned. This was a direct contradiction of my deed, and they were essentially trying to charge me rent for property I already owned. The representative spoke as if this was standard policy, as if I should just accept it and start paying. But in my gut, I knew this wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. That night, I pulled out every document I had. My purchase agreement, the deed, the HOA's bylaws, everything I had filed away when I first bought the property. Sure enough, right there in plain language, the garage was included as part of my lot. It was private property, not a communal asset. The HOA had no authority over it. Still, the thought of an HOA threatening me with fines and liens wasn't something I could brush off. I had heard horror stories of homeowners being bullied into paying bogus fees just to avoid conflict. Some had even lost their homes because of HOA overreach. I knew I had to tread carefully. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Why were they suddenly targeting me? No one else I knew in the neighborhood had ever mentioned being charged rent for their garage. Was this some new money grab scheme? Or were they specifically coming after me because they thought I wouldn't fight back? I decided to quietly ask around. Over the next few days, I spoke with a few neighbors. That's when I learned the HOA had recently hired a new board president, someone with a reputation for being controlling, power-hungry, and obsessed with squeezing every last dollar out of residents. Apparently, this so-called garage rent was his brainchild. He had pushed it through in a closed-door meeting, never giving homeowners the chance to vote on it. The more I dug, the clearer it became: this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated attempt to generate revenue by targeting unsuspecting homeowners. They were banking on the fact that most people wouldn't know their rights or wouldn't have the energy to challenge the HOA. But they had picked the wrong person. I wasn't about to hand over $150 a month for something I already owned. And I wasn't going to sit quietly while they tried to bully me. I knew I had evidence on my side, the deed was airtight, but I also knew that HOAs can be relentless. If I fought back, they would escalate. I spent hours researching HOA laws in my state, reading case studies of similar disputes, and even consulting with a lawyer online. Every source I checked confirmed the same thing: the HOA had absolutely no legal grounds to demand rent for a deeded garage. They were bluffing. But here's the thing about bullies: once you stand up to them, they usually double down before they back off. I had no doubt that if I refused to pay, they would retaliate in other ways. They might start issuing bogus violations, harassing me with letters, or even trying to fine me into submission. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me. If they got away with it once, they would keep doing it, to me and to other homeowners. This was bigger than one garage. It was about stopping them from setting a dangerous precedent. So, I made a decision. I was going to fight this all the way. Not only to protect myself, but to expose just how corrupt and manipulative this HOA had become. I gathered every piece of evidence, organized my documents, and started preparing for what I knew would be a long battle. I wasn't sure yet whether it would end in court, a community showdown, or something in between. But I did know one thing: I wasn't paying them a single cent of garage rent. And as I stood in my driveway one evening, looking at the garage they claimed wasn't mine, I felt a mix of anger and determination. This was my property, my right, and my fight. What I didn't know was just how far the HOA was willing to go to enforce their bogus rule, or how ugly the battle was about to get. The first notice demanding $150 in rent for my garage had been shocking enough, but what came next proved that the HOA wasn't bluffing. They were determined to make my life miserable until I gave in. Just a week after I ignored their so-called rent invoice, I received another letter in the mail, this one marked as an official violation notice. According to the document, I was now in violation of community rules for unauthorized use of HOA property. They were claiming that every time I parked my car inside my garage, I was committing a violation. The letter listed a fine of $50 for the first offense, increasing with each repeat violation. In other words, they were now threatening to fine me every single day for simply using my own garage. It was absurd. And yet, the letter looked frighteningly official. It listed the potential consequences of non-compliance, including suspension of community privileges, placement of a lien on my property, and legal action. Reading it, I could understand how some homeowners might panic and immediately start paying just to make the harassment stop. But I wasn't panicking, I was preparing. I made copies of every letter, carefully documenting the timeline. I photographed my garage, my deed, and even printed out the sections of the HOA bylaws that proved their claims were false. I was building a file, piece by piece, so that when the time came, I could show exactly how far they had crossed the line. The harassment didn't stop at letters. Within 2 weeks, I noticed something strange: my name appeared in the minutes of the last HOA board meeting. According to a neighbor who attended, the new president had brought up my refusal to comply as an example of community disobedience. He told the group that homeowners who resisted HOA policies were a threat to the neighborhood stability. It was clear they were trying to paint me as a problem resident, the kind of person who caused chaos and refused to follow the rules. The irony, of course, was that I was the one following the law, while they were inventing rules out of thin air. Still, the social pressure was real. A few neighbors even approached me casually, asking why I was fighting with the HOA, and warning me that it might not end well. Clearly, the board had started spreading their version of the story to make me look like the bad guy. The intimidation worked on some level. I felt the weight of being singled out, but it also fueled my determination. I wasn't just standing up for myself anymore. I was standing up for every homeowner who could be bullied into silence. Then things escalated again. One morning, I walked outside and found a bright orange sticker plastered on my garage door. It was a notice from the HOA declaring the garage community property and not for private use until fees are paid. They had actually marked my garage as if it were theirs to control. Neighbors walking by slowed down to look. Some shook their heads, others whispered. To them, it probably looked like I was in serious trouble with the HOA. That was exactly what the board wanted, to humiliate me publicly until I caved. But instead of embarrassment, I felt anger. I peeled the sticker off, photographed it for evidence, and added it to my growing file. They were crossing into dangerous territory now, and I was ready to push back harder. At this point, I reached out to a lawyer. I explained the situation, sent copies of all the letters, and showed proof of my deed. His reaction confirmed what I already knew: the HOA had absolutely no case. In fact, he said their actions might even qualify as harassment and abuse of power. The lawyer advised me to send a formal cease and desist letter, backed by legal language, demanding that they stop their bogus fines and threats. He also suggested that if they didn't back down, we could take them to court, not just to stop them, but to make them pay for damages. That gave me confidence, but I also knew one thing about HOAs: they rarely back down quietly. The moment they realized I had legal representation, they would likely double their efforts to pressure me. And sure enough, they did. Within days of receiving the cease and desist, the HOA responded with a new tactic. They sent out a community-wide newsletter claiming that certain homeowners were refusing to comply with updated garage policies, and that this refusal threatened the financial health of the neighborhood. They didn't name me directly, but it was obvious who they were talking about. Now the fight wasn't just between me and the HOA, it was being played out in front of the entire community. I was being painted as selfish, someone who didn't want to contribute like everyone else. But here's the truth: most homeowners still had no idea what was really going on. They didn't know that my garage was deeded property. They didn't know that the board had no legal authority to charge rent. They only knew what the HOA told them. That's when I realized I needed to take control of the narrative. If the board wanted to fight dirty, then I would fight with facts. I began preparing to show the community exactly how the HOA was abusing its power. And as I looked at the growing stack of letters, notices, and documents I had collected, I knew I was sitting on enough evidence to blow this whole thing wide open. The question was, how far was the HOA willing to go before they realized they had picked the wrong homeowner to mess with? By the time the HOA plastered stickers on my garage door and spread their version of the story through newsletters, it was clear this wasn't just a private dispute anymore. They wanted to make me an example. They wanted to intimidate me into paying rent on my own property so no one else would dare question their authority. But I had something they didn't: the truth, and the documents to back it up. For weeks, I had been quietly collecting evidence. Every threatening letter, every bogus fine, every attempt to humiliate me had been catalogued and filed. My lawyer confirmed again and again that they had no legal ground. But while the legal system would eventually catch up with them, I realized the more immediate battle was being fought in the court of public opinion, among my neighbors. So, I made a decision. If the HOA wanted to drag my name through the mud, I would shine a light on their corruption. I wasn't going to sit back and let them manipulate the entire community. The first step was simple: communication. Most homeowners had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. They assumed the HOA operated with fairness, that new rules were created properly, and that board members acted in everyone's best interest. What they didn't know was that decisions like this, garage rent, were being forced through without a vote, hidden under vague policy updates, and presented as non-negotiable once they were already in effect. I started by creating flyers. On them, I summarized the facts in plain, simple language: my garage was deeded property, the HOA had no right to demand rent, and their actions were not only unfair but potentially illegal. I included copies of the relevant sections of my deed and the HOA bylaws so no one could claim it was just my opinion. Then I distributed the flyers door to door, making sure every homeowner in the community got one. I didn't use angry language, I didn't make it personal, I simply laid out the truth. The reaction was immediate. Some neighbors were shocked, others were furious, and a few even thanked me for speaking up. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one who had noticed the HOA's aggressive tactics. Several homeowners admitted they had been hit with strange new fees over the past few months, charges for things like amenity usage or administrative costs that didn't make sense. Many had paid without questioning it, thinking they had no choice. Now they were beginning to connect the dots. Within a week, small groups of homeowners started discussing the issue openly. People were asking questions at board meetings, pressing for explanations, and demanding transparency. The HOA board was visibly rattled. They were used to being in control, used to residents nodding along and paying up. Suddenly, the narrative was slipping out of their hands. That's when the board made their next mistake. In response to the growing unrest, they sent out another community-wide notice, this time trying to double down. They insisted that the garage policy was legitimate, that it was necessary for fair distribution of community resources, and that anyone who refused to comply would face escalating fines and legal consequences. They framed it as a matter of community unity, trying to guilt homeowners into falling in line. But instead of calming things down, it backfired. My flyers had already exposed the truth, and people weren't buying their excuses anymore. In fact, the HOA's heavy-handed threats only made them look more corrupt. I knew then that I had momentum on my side. So, I pushed further. I scheduled a community meeting, outside of the HOA's control, at my own home. I invited every resident, provided copies of my evidence, and encouraged people to share their own experiences. That night, my living room was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, some angry, some nervous, but all eager to hear what was really going on. One by one, neighbors spoke up. Stories poured out about arbitrary fines. I scheduled a community meeting, outside of the HOA's control, at my own home. I invited every resident, provided copies of my evidence, and encouraged people to share their own experiences. That night, my living room was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, some angry, some nervous, but all eager to hear what was really going on. One by one, neighbors spoke up. Stories poured out about arbitrary fines, unexplained charges, and intimidation tactics. Some had been too afraid to challenge the HOA, worried about retaliation, but now they realized they weren't alone. When I presented my file, letters, photos, legal references, the room grew tense. Everyone could see it clearly: the HOA had overstepped, and badly. The turning point came when a retired couple revealed that they had actually paid the garage rent for months, thinking it was mandatory. They had lost hundreds of dollars before realizing something wasn't right. The anger in the room reached a boiling point. What had started as my personal battle was now a community-wide revolt. From that night forward, everything changed. Homeowners began organizing. They demanded open board meetings. They started questioning every line of the budget. And most importantly, they began calling for a vote to remove the corrupt board president who had orchestrated the garage scheme in the first place. But the HOA wasn't about to roll over. If anything, they became even more aggressive. The very next week, I received notice of an impending lien against my property, based on the false claim that I owed months of unpaid garage rent and violation fines. This was no longer just harassment. This was a direct attack on my home, my financial security, and my future. They weren't trying to scare me anymore, they were trying to break me. And as I stood in my driveway again, staring at the garage that had started it all, I realized the fight had entered a whole new level. It wasn't just about one bogus fee anymore. It was about. The lien notice arrived like a final declaration of war. It was written in cold, legal language, claiming I now owed thousands of dollars in unpaid garage rent and fines. If I didn't pay, the HOA would begin proceedings to place a lien against my home. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. A lien could ruin my credit, restrict my ability to sell, and hang over me for years. The HOA wanted me cornered, desperate, and broken. But instead of fear, I felt something else: resolve. They had pushed too far, and now I was ready to unleash everything I had prepared. I immediately forwarded the lien notice to my lawyer. He didn't even hesitate, he called it fraudulent, abusive, and completely unenforceable. He drafted a formal response, not just denying the lien, but warning the HOA that their actions constituted harassment and could result in serious legal consequences for the board itself. At the same time, I doubled down on community organizing. The meeting I had hosted weeks earlier had lit a fire among homeowners. People were fed up with the lies, the intimidation, and the endless fees. Now, with the threat of liens looming, the community realized no one was safe. If they could do this to me, they could do it to anyone. Together, we called for a special vote to remove the HOA president and replace him with someone the community could trust. The board tried to block the vote, claiming it wasn't valid, but residents had learned too much by then. We knew our bylaws, we knew our rights, and we weren't backing down. The battle lines were drawn. The court fight. Before the community vote could happen, my lawyer advised we take the HOA to court to stop the lien. It was risky, expensive, and stressful, but it was also necessary. If I didn't fight back legally, the HOA could keep harassing me forever. The day in court felt surreal. On one side, I had my lawyer, my deed, my stack of evidence, and the support of neighbors who showed up to watch. On the other, the HOA board's attorney, trying to justify their outrageous claims. When the judge reviewed my deed, it was over. Clear as day, it stated that the garage was part of my private property. The HOA had no authority, no right, and no legal standing to demand rent. The judge not only dismissed their lien attempt but also scolded the HOA for wasting the court's time. My lawyer then pushed further, requesting damages for harassment, abuse of power, and legal fees. The judge agreed to consider it, and suddenly the board was on the defensive. The fallout. News of the court's decision spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Homeowners who had been unsure now saw the truth in black and white. The HOA had tried to steal money from one of their own and had been humiliated in court. The board president's credibility evaporated overnight. Residents who once trusted him now saw him for what he was, a bully with too much power. People began openly calling for his resignation. And then came the special vote. On the day of the election, the turnout was unlike anything the community had ever seen. Dozens of homeowners showed up, many carrying copies of the flyers I had made, others bringing their own stories of abuse at the hands of the HOA. The board president tried to argue, tried to spin the narrative, but no one was buying it anymore. When the votes were counted, the result was decisive. The board president was removed from office, and new leadership was elected. Leaders who promised transparency, fairness, and accountability. Leaders who vowed never to let something like this happen again. For the first time in months, the community felt free. Making them regret it. As for me, my lawyer pursued the damages case. After weeks of negotiation, the HOA agreed to settle rather than face another humiliating courtroom loss. They covered my legal fees and issued a formal written apology, admitting they had no right to charge me rent for my garage. But honestly, the money wasn't the point. The real victory was knowing they regretted ever targeting me. Their scheme had backfired completely. Instead of making me pay, they had ended up exposed, discredited, and financially drained. And the garage? It was mine, just as it always had been. I parked my car inside that night with a sense of satisfaction that words can hardly capture. Every letter, every sticker, every threat, they had all led to this moment of vindication. The lesson. Looking back, I realized this wasn't just a battle over a garage. It was about standing up against abuse of power. HOAs, like any organization, can serve a purpose, but when the wrong people are in charge, they can become toxic, manipulative, and destructive. Most homeowners don't realize how much power an HOA can claim, and too many people just give in to avoid conflict. That's exactly what corrupt boards count on. They thrive on silence, on fear, and on people not knowing their rights. But the moment one person stands up and says, no, the entire system begins to crack. I had stood up, and in the end, I wasn't alone. My neighbors stood with me. Together, we changed the direction of the entire community. The HOA had tried to charge me rent for my own garage. Instead, they lost their president, their reputation, and their ability to bully homeowners unchecked. And me? I drove into my garage every day with pride, knowing that space was more than just a place to park my car. It was proof that when you fight for what's right, you can win, even against the people who think they have all the power. The HOA had picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. And they would regret it for years to come.